actually am excited about being here because my undergraduate degree is not in theology. It's actually in philosophy of religion, so how we think about religion. And I was the first person to graduate from La Sierra University with that particular degree, religious studies with an emphasis in philosophy of religion. And so it's been, rather than being theological and apologetic in the way that I learned about religion, I got a chance to really delve in it. And so we're talking about thinking faith. But the first question is whether or not we are thinking about faith or if our faith is a thinking faith. And it's dangerous to ask this question when the guy who wrote the book is in the room. That's not fair, right? Because Nathan's like, I've got the answer, but we're gonna play around with this a little bit. So I thought that what we do is we talk a little bit about thinking about faith, and this is worth mentioning. I think this is the conversation that we'll tackle first, and then tomorrow, when I get an opportunity, we're going to tackle the idea of thinking faith, of a faith that thinks. But I grew up in a home where we thought a little bit differently. My father was a theologian. All his friends were theologians. He worked at La Sierra University. All his friends worked at La Sierra University or PUC or Loma Linda University. So I had this opportunity to grow up in a home where, you know how you kind of take apart the preacher's sermon after church? We do it kindly. We do it in love. And our pastor was Lyle Heiss, who was an Australian. And so, first of all, it took us a while to figure out what he was saying because he had a weird accent. He kept saying things like mate, and we were like, what? Who is that? What's that? A brilliant man, right? He kept saying stuff like, you should take notes on this in a sermon. And I was like 12. I was like, no, I'm not taking notes. But my dad did. And so people would come over to our house for lunch, and we would think about faith. And they would exegete the sermon, which probably wasn't fair, but luckily Lyle's an amazing preacher. So I was lucky enough to grow up with some of the greatest theologians of our particular tradition as friends of my dad. And, rather than talking about like where the haystack's good, it had more to do with like the theological tenets of open theism, or is the social gospel still relevant? Or what does liberation theology do to the idea of atonement? These were the kind of conversations people were having. And that's really a lot more than a 13-year-old should really be interested in. And a lot of times I wasn't. I just wanted to go read comic books in my room. But sometimes it caught my attention. So we asked the question, how do you think about faith? Is it logical? Should it be? Can it be? Is faith just the culmination of this logic, or is it something else? Dallas Willard first asked this question to begin the conversation. He says, what is thinking? Because that's probably where we should start, right? It's the activity of searching out what must be true or cannot be true in light of given facts or assumptions. It extends the information we have and enables us to see the larger picture, both clearly and as wholly as much as is possible. It reveals falseness, inaccuracy, and error to those who wish to know. It is a powerful gift of God to be used in the service of truth. So it seems that we must apply good thinking if we are to have a good faith. Because the truth is, faith and reason are not antithetical to each other. They are not at odds with each other. Rather, they can go hand in hand. But let's be clear, good thinking does not always lead to faith. And faith does not always lead to good thinking. And our faith pioneers, if we can call them that, our early church mother and fathers in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition actually held a belief that we should hold. And this belief is to keep thinking. If you don't believe me, this is what Ellen White writes in Counsels to Writers and Editors. Got to remember to point that way. Anyway, there is no excuse for anyone taking the position that there is no more truth to be revealed and that all our expositions of Scripture are without error. The fact that certain doctrines have been held as truth for many years by our people is not proof that our ideas are infallible. Age will not make error into truth, and truth can afford to be fair. She was writing this a long time ago. No true doctrine will lose anything by close investigation. And then she continues. She says, shall we drive our stakes of doctrine one after the other and then try to make all Scripture meet our established positions? Long cherished opinions must not be regarded as infallible. Those who sincerely desire truth will not be reluctant to lay open their positions for investigation and criticism, and will not be annoyed if their opinions and ideas are crossed. This was the spirit cherished among us 40 years ago. We have many lessons to learn and many, many to unlearn. God and heaven alone are infallible. Come on. This little old lady's like, I wrote a bunch of stuff. Take a look at it. Some of it still works, but maybe some of it doesn't. So we can change our minds because truth can afford to be fair. This is why, as a Seventh-day Adventist tradition, we are non-creedal. There we go. We are non-creedal, right? This means that we're supposed to keep exploring, keep plumbing the depths of understanding so that we can get a greater, clearer, and more precise understanding of Jesus, of God, and of this thing that we call faith. In fact, we were super serious about this at the beginning of our religious tradition. There's a quote I love that comes from 1861, J.N. Loughborough. And he says this, the first step of apostasy is to get up a creed telling us what we shall believe. The second is to make that creed a test of fellowship. The third is to try members by that creed. The fourth is to denounce as heretics those who do not believe that creed. And the fifth, to commence persecution against such. Come on, these are a bunch of people who were just establishing faith. And they were like, and I wonder if it's because of this. All right, and I apologize, and you may think I'm a heretic, but I wonder if it's because they started with a mistake. We call it the Great Disappointment. But it was a mistake, right? It was them standing on a hill on a Thursday night going, this is the day, and then standing on a hill on Friday morning going, we were not exactly right in our math, right? And so I wonder if that put them in a position where they were like, listen, we were sure and we were wrong. So let's be as sure as we can, open to new revelation, open to new thinking, open to new opportunities to investigate what it is that we should know. Right? So I guess we ask the question, how do we think about faith? Which begs a greater question, of course. It begs the question of whether or not faith is something to be thought about or taken, as it were, by faith. Right? This is a fun philosophical exercise. If faith is by definition something that we take on faith, what good does it do to think about it? Shouldn't we just accept it? I mean, should we just accept it? So the answer to that is yes and no. Because it's philosophy. So we don't ever have to land. Right? You know what philosophy is versus science, right? Science is learning more and more about less and less. And philosophy is learning less and less about more and more. That's probably an oversimplification. But because accepting the idea of faith and accepting a particular faith tradition and all its tenets are actually two very different things. We can say, I have faith, as truly we all do have faith in things. But do we accept the particularities of a certain faith? Because that is a different question altogether. We should probably accept the idea that we all have faith, but this means we have to answer a bigger and perhaps a different question. This is why philosophy is fun, because it just begs more questions. So the question is this: what do you have faith in? Because that's ultimately the interesting question. Having faith or agreeing to the concept of faith is not the same as defining what it is that you have faith in. The in part makes all the difference in the world. So maybe this is the best question of all. Since we all have faith in things or something, how do you go about defining that thing which you believe in? I mean, have you ever done this? Have you ever made a list of like the top 100 things that you believe in? Because we all have faith. Every once in a while, somebody will say, I just don't have faith. And I'm like, that's not true. You sat on that chair. When you sat down, you had faith, right? Because there's other chairs you sat down on and you didn't have the same sort of faith. We all have faith in a lot of different things. For sure, right? Hundreds of things. I believe this chair will hold me. I believe in others enough to believe that in the social contract that we've all agreed upon when we're on the road driving together. You know, you have incredible faith in other people. I was driving with my 16-year-old daughter one time, and she said she had just gotten her license, and she's driving, and I'm in a panic, you know. And she said, "Hey, I got a question for you, Dad." And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Why is it we don't just all run into each other?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she's like, we could all just ram our cars into each other." And I was like, "Can you keep your hands on the wheel and look forward, please? Maybe this is a discussion for another time, like at a stop sign." And she's like, no. Why do we have faith in one another? And I was like, "Well, we've all kind of agreed to this social contract." And she said, "Yeah, but why?" And I was like, "I don't know. So we don't all kill each other." And she's like, "I guess that's a good enough reason." I was like, "Is it now?" Because when you break it down like that, you're just like all just a very thin sheet of metal away from all dying all the time. Right? But, you know, I agree what they tell me about my food is true. It's organic. Is it? It's free range. In America, free range only means like 3 feet. In Australia, free range means we may never see that chicken again. Right? You got a lot more land. But we take these things on faith, right? We all have a great deal of beliefs, a great many things that we have faith in. Some are known to us, but some are unknown. We take them by faith without much consideration. Like, it was fascinating to me when people are like, "I'm not going to take that vaccine. I don't know what's in it." I was like, "Bro, you don't know what's in the sandwich you ate today. You just took it on faith." Some dude behind a counter was like, "It's fine." You're like, "Okay, it hasn't been sitting there for 3 weeks. I'm sure that's fine, right?" We take pills, we take aspirin. We don't know what is in them. So we should never say that we don't have faith. We have a ton of faith. But we do need to find what it is we have faith in. And having faith in God, I guess, is having faith in God beyond the realm of reason. Or do we have faith in religion? And this is a good question, because religion and faith are not necessarily the same thing, although they have become as such in the vernacular of the day, which, by the way, is started in 1325 with the first usage of faith as religion. Before that, they were separated. I mean, I sometimes say from my pulpit, in our faith tradition as opposed to in our religious tradition, but I mean the same thing. But you know, this word religion is interesting. It means to bind. And religion has a tendency to bind us to answers. Therefore, religion is what you have bound yourself to, right? Religare means to bind. These are the things that I bind myself to. So it could be a belief in God. It could be a particular set of doctrines or practices. It could be all those things or none of those things. And listen, we as humans, we like answers. So we like to bind ourselves to answers if we can. However, debate within the early church was never this idea of answers versus faith, or faith versus reason, we could say. Rather, it was how and in what amount reason should inform faith. Faith was the assumed position of someone who was alive. There was not the idea that you could think your way into faith, but rather that faith is the air that we breathe and the water that we swim. And what we've done is we've bound ourselves to a bunch of answers, and we've called that religion. And we need to probably be a little careful about that. Because while religion has a tendency to bind us to answers, faith has a tendency to bind us to questions. And I find this to be much more interesting. The questions that faith brings up are things that I find fascinating. And in fact, Paul spoke to what faith is in the quintessential text on faith, right? Where it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And I did quote from the King James Version, which I rarely do. But that seems right? That's how we learn that. It's the substance of these things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It pushes back on the sin of certainty, understanding that we are living in this place of questions, and that is okay. And I got to tell you, it seemed like Jesus, rather than relegating himself, rather than binding himself to answers, he liked to live in the questions a lot more than anything else. And in fact, he liked to live in a good conversation. And this is why we see Jesus time and time again looking to engage us in a better understanding through dialogue rather than simply sage on the stage teaching. Don't believe me? We'll take a look at a parable. But he spoke in what was called non-literal utterances, which in more plain words means it's something that was not, is not, and was never meant to be taken literally. And we call these non-literal utterances parables. We call them parables, short stories that seem to always have a moral. But did the first century hearers hear them in the same way that we do? Probably not. In fact, they were often used to keep engagement happening amongst the hearers rather than to answer every single question. The truth is, we are more comfortable with a creed than a call. And this is why we love doctrine, right? But Jesus didn't speak in doctrine. Jesus spoke in parables, and he spoke of relationships, and he spoke of all these indefinable, mysterious things that are a huge mess. I mean, I don't know about you, but I would have loved if Jesus would have came and said, listen, here's the 14 things. And we as Adventists would have said, 14? There's at least 14 more. But Jesus didn't do that, which is why I love the fact that our particular tradition is non-creedal. Because Jesus didn't come to set down a creed. And we can agree with creeds. I mean, that's fine. But we, as a tradition, have always said, you know, this begs more conversation. This begs some more faith and maybe a little less religion. Right? Jesus didn't speak in doctrine. He spoke in parables so that we would see needs and respond. In fact, our secret understanding of the world, what is right and what is wrong, would be ignited again to inform the way that we live our lives. So I guess the question is, what do we want from the parables? That's the question. What do we want from the parables? Do we want morality stories? Do we want these cute little blessings that are all tied up with answers to every question? I was preaching one time, and a person came up to me and said, I don't like your preaching. I was like, great, thanks. Appreciate that. Never know what to do with those things. Like, I've been doing this for a while. It's not like if someone comes up and says, I don't like your preaching, I'm going to go, oh, I didn't know. Let me change all that. Like, I'm not going to do that. But they came up and they said, I don't really like your preaching. And I said, oh, okay. Why? And they said, because you don't give us the blessing at the end. I said, what do you mean? I'm not sure what you mean. And she said, listen, I like a preacher who poses a question at the beginning and then spends time answering that question and then wraps it all up, ties in a little bow, and gives me the blessing. And she said, could you do that more? And I said, no. And she was very frustrated. She said, why not? I said, because I want you to talk about this sermon when you go home. I want you to talk about the questions that we asked and the mystery that we delved into when you go home. And she said, that seems like a lot of work. I said, well, maybe you need a new church. She may have found one. Right? I mean, even with the parables, I got to tell you, we want to domesticate the messages of Jesus down to be nice, like the Samaritan, or you'll be forgiven, like the prodigal son, or do we want to wrestle with the conversation that Jesus invites us to through these utterings? So let's take a look at just one, and I know we're getting late here, so we'll move quickly. And it's one that's really simple, you know it. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a simple story, right? Guy going to Jericho. On the road, gets stopped by robbers, burglars, whatever the word is we want to say. Do you have to burgle a place? You can rob a person, but you burgle a place? Nobody knows. What's that?
Burgling is without threats.
Fascinating. I've learned something today. Thank you for that. I'm so appreciative. That's thinking faith right there. Okay, so you know the story. He's going down to Jericho, gets beat up, he's laying on the ground. He's out, he's bloody. Priest walks by, goes around the other side. Levite walks by, goes around the other side. Samaritan shows up, picks him up, put him on his donkey, takes him to the inn pays the innkeeper some stuff, and leaves, right? What do we normally get from this? What we normally get from this is that priests and Levites were not great people, right? The Samaritan, great guy, right? Be like the Samaritan. That's the third point. And then fourth point, maybe don't go down to Jericho on that same road. That's kind of what we get, right? But if we were to look at this conversation a little bit differently, we begin to see that there's so much more going on. It's the way that we approach our faith, the way that we think about faith, right? Rather than just a prescribed way, but saying, hey, let's stop thinking about the answers for a second and let's think about the questions, because the question that's posed is really this: what must I do to be saved, right? What's going on? And this guy goes to Jesus and he's like, hey, what do I have to do? And Jesus says, what do you think? Because Jesus knew that when you talk to an expert, you don't have to answer any questions. You just have to ask them questions because they want to answer them all, right? That's the problem with getting a doctorate. You think you know something. So Jesus says, what do you think? And see, that was a very common question because there were two schools of thought going on at the time. There was Hillel and there was Shammai, right? And those two schools of thought, one was love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. I believe that was Shammai. And Hillel was love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, all that, and be pure. Those were the two schools of thought that were going on. Jesus was clearly from Shammai. So Jesus says, what do you think? And the guy answers the question correctly. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he's like, you're right. Do that. That'd be awesome. And the guy's like, well, I don't really want to do it. That seems like a lot of work. So, being an expert in the law, he decided to vociferate a little bit. He decided to say, hey, maybe let's break this down a little bit. And he goes, well, yeah, but I don't really know who my neighbor is. And Jesus goes, let me tell you a story. And then he goes ahead and he tells the story, same story that you just heard, right? But what we begin to realize is that there's a lot more going on in the story. For instance, like a priest would have worked, 7 to 10 days in the temple, and then he would have been off for a few weeks. But as he went to go work at the temple, it would have taken a day and a half to 2 days to really become ritually clean. And the same, as he's leaving the temple, it would have taken a couple days to become clean. He's walking down the road. He sees this guy. According to Levitical law, he can't touch somebody who's bleeding, and he certainly can't touch a foreigner. He doesn't know if this guy's a foreigner, but he does know for sure that he's bleeding. He doesn't really want to go back now that he's on vacation. He doesn't really want to go back and wash up for 2 more days just to handle this guy, so he walks around. Then comes a Levite. You know who a Levite was? His secretary. If your boss isn't going to touch that guy, do you think you're going to touch that guy? No, you don't want to make your boss look bad. So he walks around too. Samaritan shows up, doesn't have quite the same understanding or relationship with Levitical law, and decides, I'm going to take care of this guy. And then does more than just take care of this guy. He's moved with compassion, right? He actually picks him up, puts him on his donkey, takes him there, and then he pays for his health care. And he says, if there's any more that you need to do to take care of this man, let me pay for that as well. I'll pay for that when I come back. He actually set up, he wasn't just full of compassion, he actually set up a system of advocacy for the man. Like, that's really powerful. And then Jesus tells the story and he looks at the guy and he goes, so, who should you be like? And the guy's like, well, this is easy. Probably like the guy who helped him. Doesn't he want to say Samaritan, right? Dirty word. It's probably like the guy who helped him. And Jesus said an interesting thing. Jesus said, yeah, go and do that, right? There is more to what was going on in the story, right? Go and do. At the end of the day, this was a call to action. It wasn't a moral, like a story with a little blessing in it. It was a reminder of what the young man believed actually to be true. In this way, Jesus was speaking prophetically into this man's life. Because you know what a prophet does? A prophet speaks to a group of people and says, not that way, that way. That's the wrong way. Go this way. And sometimes he'll get a little spicy, right? Because he'll say, don't go that way, you cows of Bashan. Minor Prophets, you should read them. They're super fun, right? He's talking to all the women. He's all, hey, cows of Bashan. That's not complimentary. Just in case you were wondering. Right? Don't go that way. That's the cow way. Go this way, right? Which is the prophetic voice. right? And sometimes pastors speak in prophetic voices. And when prophets show up, they speak in prophetic voices, obviously, not that way, this way. And obviously, when Jesus showed up, he was speaking prophetically into this man's life. And he was saying, listen, I gave you this little word study so that you could remember what you said you believed at the beginning. And now I'm telling you, go do those things that you say that you believe. You must be engaged, not just have an answer. So when we think about faith, we have to think about faith differently. Jesus was speaking prophetically, but he was just more clever. And his words and his cleverness still ring true today. How are you being called to be engaged in the revelation that God is showing you in your life? How are the words that you find in Scripture pulling us to think about faith in new and revelatory ways? How is the way we think about faith calling us to engage more deeply? Because one of the biggest tragedies, in my opinion, of the preaching that happens within our faith tradition is it sounds like this: we're right. Let me explain to you why we're right so you'll know we're right. See? But we actually come from a tradition that says we were wrong, we think we're right, but we should probably talk about it some more. And let's make sure we don't write it down as a checklist to make sure we stay engaged in the conversation. Now, that's our philosophical understanding of how we engage with faith and thinking about faith. That is not necessarily the practice that we experience in church. So we have to demand conversation. We have to demand dialogue beyond monologue. That's really important for us to do, right? So we have to, how the way we think about faith and how it's calling to engage us in the conversation more deeply is important. And that conversation can be with God, it can be with others, it can even be within ourselves. Are we willing to approach our faith differently than we have, from new angles and new perspectives? Are we willing to deconstruct and then be patient before we reconstruct our faith with those elemental pieces that we have left? And maybe there's just one more question that we need to ask, and then I'll finish tonight. Are you willing to trust? And I know you probably weren't expecting that question. Because here's the tough part. You have to be willing to trust that the Holy Spirit will guide you to a greater understanding, will guide you to a better way to think about and engage in faith. And listen, I know it might be a stretch because there are times where we don't feel like trusting God. But when we get to a place where the answer or where the questions become more important than the answers, we have to trust in God, because those answers might not be forthcoming in a way that just wraps it all up and makes it a blessing. But when we approach faith with an open mind, with an open heart, and with a trust that God will continue to reveal himself to us, whether it's through music or art, or whether it's through the study of Scripture from a new angle, or whether it's through listening to a podcast, because there's a million of them out there. When we decide that we're going to engage in this conversation of thinking about faith and engage in a thinking faith, there's a great deal of trust that has to be put in to where we'll land. And I know it scares people. We're actually doing a series on deconstruction that starts this week at our church. And my pastors who are having to preach, because I apparently come to Australia like every other week, they're like, why do we have to preach about this? What if we destroy someone's faith? And I said, you got to trust in God that we're not going to, and then be careful maybe with what you're going to say. Because we're all in the process of deconstructing and reconstructing our faith all the time, whether we admit to it or not. Every new piece of information has to somewhere fit. Sometimes old information ceases to be relevant. And you can't build a house of faith by just piling more and more and more on. All you get is a speed bump. You have to figure out, how to build walls and how to build rooms and how to make it a place where we can live. But that all comes from trust. So we got to think about how we think about faith.